In Part 3, we explored what really amounts to the beginning of the end for France as a player in the New World. Lack of serious population growth, over-reliance on native allies, as well as force multipliers like fortifications, in the face of the maturing American colonies to the south, put New France in a situation where they had to get lucky every time. As we saw with the capture of Louisbourg, the Americans were beginning to shake off their timid predisposition to war. The failure of King George's War to resolve the underlying tensions between New England and New France, the two main problems being the pirate fortress of Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island, which was returned to France at the end of the war from Madras in India, the second being the large Acadian population, which found itself under the British yoke in Nova Scotia, who were, to say the least, not happy with the present arrangement. Before we get too far though, this is the fourth and final part of the New France series, and a link to the other parts will be in the video description. If you like these kind of videos, then dropping a like would be great, and subscribing to Mid-Atlantic Chronicles even better. But just watching is more than enough for me. Thank you. Following the events of King George's War, Great Britain sought to solidify its hold over Nova Scotia, whose still mostly Acadian and Micmac populations rebelled during the war, sacking Canso and besieging Annapolis Royal, the only two British settlements in Nova Scotia. In 1749, the Board of Trade appointed Edward Cornwallis as governor of Nova Scotia, and sent him with some objectives to accomplish, with the ultimate goal of turning the home rule possession of Nova Scotia into a proper colony. On June 21st, the sloop of war Sphinx, and between 13 and 15 transports, carried Cornwallis, his troops, and settlers into Chebucto Bay, where they immediately began construction of Halifax, named for the president of the Board of Trade, George Montague Dunk, 2nd Earl of Halifax, who chose the site. This action violated William Drummer's Treaty of Boston, which ended Father Rale's War 25 years previous, as well as the many peace and friendship treaties the British had with the various Wabanaki-aligned bands in Nova Scotia and Maine. Cornwallis's speedy construction of the redoubt of Halifax Citadel on the aptly named Citadel Hill, in addition to its accompanying stockade forts, as well as the presence of upwards of 2,500 British settlers, immediately attracted the attention of the Acadians and Micmac. On September 18th, a petition signed by 1,000 Acadians, along with representatives of the larger settlements, protested Cornwallis's demand that they swear an oath of fealty to King George II and convert to Anglicanism, with a deadline of October 25th. The Acadians rejected these terms out of hand, stating they would rather leave than submit to Britain. Starting punctually, the British troops began systematically administering the oaths. Any Acadians that refused would be forcibly removed from their homes. In response, the French and their allies kept the region in a near constant state of violence, in an attempt to frustrate further British consolidation of the peninsula. Once more, Father Loutre rallied his Acadian militia and Micmac allies to begin waging a classic guerrilla war on the British, attacking vulnerable settlers and high-value military targets, with the commander of Fort Edward at Windsor refusing to heed Cornwallis's summons without an escort of 30 soldiers, citing Acadian activity in the area. The establishment of Halifax had an effect on the wider policy of New France, recognizing the St. John River corridor as a route of attack from New England, and of course the Isthmus of Chignecto, not only as a route of attack from Halifax, but also the only land route to Louisbourg. To remedy these issues, the French constructed Fort Menagouche at the mouth of the St. John River in what is now New Brunswick, Fort Gaspereau at Baie Verte, and Fort Beausejour at Chignecto, both on the isthmus. In response, Massachusetts fortified the Kennebec River in Maine, and a general air of escalation settled over the North Atlantic. Many Acadians began escaping Nova Scotia, simply packing up and retreating into New France, with many going to mainland Acadia by just passing through the Isthmus of Chignecto, settling in the settlement of Beaubassin on the Mississauga River, between the modern towns of Sackville and Amherst. Soon, though, the construction of the French and British fortifications, as well as the resulting military buildup, prevented the Acadians from moving through the isthmus, and refugees began to head to Cape Breton Island, leaving by sea to places like the Isle St. John, more than doubling the population over the duration of the war. While some left, other Acadians remained, most of them men whose families had fled and who planned to, at the very least, make Britain bleed for every farmstead, field, and cow they lost. As Acadians moved out, settlers loyal to King George moved in. Some of these settlers were from Britain, most of whom were former sailors and soldiers, though the Board of Trade had invited a number of Swiss, French, and German Protestants from the mountainous border region around the Upper Rhine, known simply as the Foreign Protestants. Soon, though, the promise of freshly Acadian-free real estate attracted settlers from New England who began to pour into the colony. These Nova Scotian settlers were under near constant attack by Loutre's fighters, who were always ambushing soldiers, raiding settlements, and looting ships. In response, Cornwallis offered a bounty of 10 guineas, approximately $850 in today's money, for Micmac scalps, to which the Nova Scotians began going full-blood Meridian, annihilating any chance at diplomacy with the Micmacs. Not that I think at this point any of the factions could or would be diplomatic about the situation, with several treaties negotiated and broken constantly, and for little to no provocation on both sides. In the spring of 1753, after a winter in terrible conditions, the foreign Protestants who settled at Lunenburg rebelled. Many spoke or at least understood French and sympathized with the Acadians. Cornwallis dispatched Colonel Robert Monckton, who arrested rebel leader John Hoffman, with many of the French and some of the Swiss joining Loutre after the situation was mishandled by Lieutenant Governor Charles Lawrence, casting a pall of suspicion over the colony, particularly on those foreign Protestants that remained loyal British subjects. In this time, the movements of even the British settlers were restricted, whether by the soldiers guarding the colony or raids, as in Lawrencetown, where a whole summer of relentless raids saw the settlers abandon Lawrencetown for the relative safety of Halifax. At the same time as Father Loutre's war was boiling over in Nova Scotia, in Virginia, a young planter was commissioned as a major in the militia and sent to secure Virginia's claims to the Ohio country, to which Major Washington was captured by the French, who told him they were not leaving the Ohio country, but guess who was? Upon Washington's return to Virginia, he was promoted to lieutenant colonel for not dying. Washington was then put in command of the Virginia Regiment under Colonel and Commander-in-Chief of North America Joshua Fry, who died soon thereafter on the way to Fort Duquesne. Under Washington's command, the Virginians constructed the hastily built Fort Necessity, some 50 miles from the Forks. On May 28, 1754, Colonel Washington ambushed the entourage of 2nd Ensign Joseph Collin de Villers, Sieur de Jumonville, a messenger for his brother, Captain Louis Collin de Villers, commander of Fort Duquesne, capturing the Canadians while they rested in what this incident would name Jumonville Glen. Due primarily to a hard language barrier between the Virginians and Canadians, the situation spiraled. Washington's Mingo ally, the war chief Tanacharison, suddenly stepped towards Jumonville, killing him with a tomahawk blow to the head before scalping him as his men scalped the Canadians killed in the ambush. On July 2nd, the Canadians at Fort Duquesne attacked the ramshackle Fort Necessity, killing 31 and capturing more than 300 soldiers, including Washington, whom the French blamed for the killing of the Sieur de Jumonville. News of the popular Sieurs' slaying and subsequent mutilation by scalping spread like wildfire, with the battles in the Ohio quickly folding Father Loutre's war into an escalating conflict, beginning what the Canadians called the Fourth Intercolonial War, preceding the official declaration of hostilities between Great Britain and France in North America, which came on May 17, 1753, all becoming the North American theater of the 7 Years' War, which began with the French invasion of Minorca on April 20th, 1756, shortly ballooning into a global war. Previously, the colonies found themselves at war with each other due to some kerfuffle in Europe, using it simply as a way to settle old scores. This time, the war was started in the colonies and spread not only to Europe, but South America, West Africa, India, and the Philippines, this time giving old foes like Prussia and Austria, or Portugal and Spain, their good excuse to settle old scores. General Edward Braddock took command on February 20th, 1755 as the first Commander-in-Chief North America upon reaching the colonies, and planned a four-pronged assault on New France, with General William Shirley attacking Fort Niagara from Massachusetts, Brigadier General William Johnson attacking Fort St. Frederick from New York, Colonel Robert Monckton attacking Fort Beausejour from Nova Scotia, and Braddock himself leading an army from Virginia to capture Fort Duquesne. Of the four offensives, half were set in motion on time. Shirley and Johnson feuded over the limited resources available to them, with troops being diverted from Johnson to cover troops Shirley was sending to Monckton, greatly delaying both armies. Braddock set off from Fort Cumberland on May 29th, crossing the Monongahela River by July 9th, immediately meeting the Canadians 16 miles southeast of Fort Duquesne on the eastern side of the river, initiating the Battle of the Monongahela. Though Braddock's forces outnumbered the Canadians by a good 400 men, and the death of the French commander Daniel Lenard de Beaujeu in the opening minutes of the battle, the British soldiers were unruly and disorganized. Braddock as well underestimated the Canadians, who devastated the British with withering sniper fire. The British troops simply stood in their field waiting for the Canadians to join them for a European-style battle, all the while the Canadians and their native allies shredded them with hit-and-run attacks from the dense Appalachian forests. The British troops soon began volley firing into the woodline, Braddock believing that the discipline of his regulars would overwhelm the Canadians. The British held for 3 hours before Braddock was shot in the lung and off his horse, breaking the British, who began a sloppy rout back across the river, George Washington rallying just enough troops to form a rear guard and defend the others as they carried the wounded across the river, including Braddock, who would die on the other side of the Monongahela. News of Braddock's defeat reached Shirley before either he or Johnson had gotten very far, with the office of Commander-in-Chief now falling to Shirley, who was on his way to Fort Niagara, having gotten bogged down in Fort Oswego when the news reached him. Also learning of the death of his younger son William, who was serving under Braddock. The defeat and responsibility of Commander-in-Chief forced Shirley to return to Albany and take command, ending his offensive. However, Johnson continued to amass forces for his attack on Fort St. Frederick. On May 22, 1755, 3 warships, 2,100 New England militia, and 250 British regulars departed Boston, landing at Fort Lawrence on June 2nd, initiating the siege of Fort Beausejour that would last 2 weeks. The British under Lieutenant Colonel Robert Monckton defeated Father Loutre's Acadians, who attempted to break the siege, building elaborate siege works and bombarding the fort. False information from spies in the fort and from captured English soldiers greatly demoralized the defenders, who capitulated on June 16th, leaving their weapons and retreating west into Acadia with what they could carry from the fort, which was promptly razed, leaving Quebec exposed. More immediately, the Acadians remaining in Nova Scotia were forcibly expelled by the elite Rogers Rangers. In the end, over 11,000 Acadians would be deported. Most Acadians were sent to France via the American colonies, though some escaped directly to Louisiana, where many would later join from France, becoming the Louisianais and Cajuns of Lower Louisiana. Many, though, like Noel Doiron and his family, would be killed, as the rough seas destroyed the old ships the British employed for the deportations. News of Braddock's army being sent to the New World reached King Louis XV before the British regulars even left, prompting Louis to dispatch 3,000 or 4,000 regular French troops to New France, the first time in 90 years that French troops had been deployed to the colony. The soldiers under the command of the German-born French general Jean-Armand the Baron Discoux departed Brest in February with the first half of his troops, with his second-in-command Colonel Rostang to follow in the next few months, though Rostang and his troops became separated from the larger fleet and were attacked on June 8th by a British squadron off Cape Ray, Newfoundland, capturing 2 of the 3 lost French ships of the line, which were transporting companies from the Regiment de la Reine and the Regiment de Languedoc. Most of the French soldiers, however, reached New France, either by Louisbourg or directly to Quebec City. These troops were strictly for defensive purposes, meant to free up local Canadians from garrison duty, but as the situation deteriorated, the Metropolitans became the backbone of the defense of the colony. Arriving on August 28, 1755, General Johnson mustered his troops at the newly constructed Fort Edward just south of Hudson Falls for his attack on Fort St. Frederick. Baron Discoux sought to counter Johnson's amassed forces while at Fort Edward, but his native allies refused, as Johnson had set up his cannons in the fort, the Abenaki suggesting instead to catch the New Yorkers in the open when they began their march north, to which the Baron agreed. The Canadians attacked as the British were encamped at the southern end of Lake George, intending to ambush the advance guard before assaulting the camp, but the ambush was spoiled by a staunch fighting retreat put up by the New York and Mohawk scouts, as well as the presence of 3 well-placed cannons in Johnson's camp, and later the arrival of over 1,000 Massachusetts reinforcements under Colonel Ephraim Williams, catching the French off guard on all points. The immediate death of the popular Canadian commander Jacques Legare de Saint-Pierre also deeply affected the French allies. After the French troops had fled, in the chaos, the Baron Dieskau was wounded and captured by William's troops, who, while surrendering, reached in his pocket for his watch, to which he was shot by one of the Yankees, thinking he was going for a weapon, inflicting a mortal wound that would eventually kill the Baron over a decade later. In the meantime, though, the British would fortify that position as Fort William Henry. Pursuant to the French project of dominance in the vast American interior, New France sought close ties with their native allies, expending extensive effort and treasure in acquiring and maintaining these relationships. Even with the French troops freeing up Canadian soldiers, the bulk of the hard fighting was done by a minority of Canadians and a majority of native allies. Even during the Battle of the Monongahela, most of the Canadian militia fled the field once Braddock's full army had entered the battle, the day being carried mostly by 600 Ottawa, Ojibwa, and Potawatomi warriors, and around 100 more elite Canadian Marines. The native allies would form more or less the tip of the spear, being primarily used for offensive or asymmetrical operations, which they excelled at, utilizing not only their highly effective hit-and-run tactics, but psychological warfare on and off the battlefield. Owing to New France's less chaotic governmental structure, the colony was far better able to rally their troops and allies, giving the Canadians the advantage in many a previous war, with the broad objective being simply to harry the border regions and prevent the British from capturing Quebec long enough for the war to resolve in Europe. Previously, British colonial fortifications had been lacking to say the least, but with the growing intensity of conflict in the region, the need for defenses could no longer be ignored, and the British did substantially upgrade their defenses since the end of King George's War. Following the capture of the Baron d'Escoues, a second wave of French reinforcements arrived in the spring of 1756 under the command of Brigadier General Louis-Joseph de Montcalm-Gozon, the Marquis de Montcalm de Saint-Véran, or, for our purposes, General Montcalm. Governor-General Pierre de Rigaud, the Marquis de Vaudreuil, feuded with both Baron d'Escoues and General Montcalm, going so far as to tell King Louis upon the Baron's capture that he didn't need to send a new general, advice that was ignored in Versailles. Vaudreuil deeply disliked the metropolitan French generals, who he felt didn't have the necessary experience in North American-style fighting, being too reliant on the same tactics and strategies that, while effective in the fields of Europe, just got a British major general killed on a riverbank in the Pennsylvania backcountry. Upon arriving in Montreal, General Montcalm decided to attack William Shirley's former troops, who were still fortifying Fort Oswego in preparation for the stalled attack on Fort Niagara, a good opportunity to wipe out another one of the British armies, departing from Fort Carillon on July 19, 1756, with 3,000 troops. Fort Oswego was a complex of 3 fortifications, with the main fort consisting of a stone blockhouse and wall and 2 outlying log forts, Fort Ontario on the east side of the Oswego River, and Fort George built on a bluff about half a mile to the southwest, the latter being hastily constructed and incomplete. The defenses had a garrison of about 2,000, with a little less than half being non-combatants, living in what would later grow into the current city of Oswego. The troops had a hard winter and suffered greatly from scurvy. Even by summer, the difficulty in maintaining the often harassed supply line from Albany had not allowed the garrison to fully recover. Montcalm had arrived by August 10th and began a European-style siege, confident that the defenders wouldn't be able to hold out. First attacking Fort Ontario, which fought until after nightfall on the 13th before the defenders abandoned it, fleeing to the main fort, which the French occupied and used to bombard Fort Oswego, quickly reducing the stone walls and killing the commanding officer, Colonel James Mercer, with the garrison surrendering soon thereafter. All 1,700 captured defenders, including the non-combatants, were taken to Montreal without the honors of war, as Montcalm felt that they didn't defend hard enough. Then Fort Oswego was plundered and razed. The French continued on to attack the Oneida Carry, a 4-mile trail that connected the upper Mohawk River at modern-day Rome to the westward flowing Wood Creek, which emptied out into Lake Oneida, which was defended by Fort Williams on the Mohawk side and Fort Bull on the Wood Creek side. Fort Bull was little better than a palisade and a few storehouses, but unfortunately for the defenders, one of those storehouses, the powder magazine, held far more gunpowder than normal. On the morning of March 27th, a small group of French and natives attacked the fort, chopping their way through the gate and slaughtering almost all the defenders before burning the supplies. When the fire reached the gunpowder, the fort was, quote, blown to atoms. After the annihilation of Fort Bull, the fortifications around the Oneida Carry were dismantled to prevent them from falling into French hands, and the defenders retreated back to German flats. Following the victory at Oswego, Governor-General Vaudreuil and General Montcalm began planning for the defense of Fort Carillon, expecting the British to counterattack there. Soon, however, news from their spies came that indicated any advance on the British part would be on Louisbourg and not in the upper Hudson, causing the two to change their plans to an attack on Fort William Henry to push the New Yorkers out of Lake George. Vaudreuil put out the word for any native warriors to come to Fort Carillon, and, in the time between then and the attack, a little under 2,000 native allies from various tribes heeded his call, the majority not being from the St. Lawrence, but from the Pays de Haut, or upcountry in English, which encompasses everything west of Montreal, with some natives coming from far afield as the Great Plains. On July 13, 1757, General Montcalm sent his 8,000-strong army to Fort William Henry under Montcalm's second-in-command, François Gaston de Levis, styled the Chevalier de Levis, who arrived in the early morning of August 3rd, with Montcalm arriving soon after. By the 4th, negotiations for Lieutenant Colonel George Monro's unconditional surrender broke down, and Montcalm initiated the siege, opening fire with what for that day was one battery of cannons. The next day, the second battery was in place, doubling the amount of cannons firing at William Henry, who were also firing their cannons back. Eventually, however, due to damage from the French and overuse, Fort William Henry's cannons quickly became inoperable, with the garrison surrendering on August 9th. When the garrison did surrender, Montcalm gave them full military honors for putting up a good fight. In exchange, the soldiers agreed to 18 months of parole, meaning that they would give their word to Montcalm that they wouldn't fight for 18 months, a relatively standard series of events for a siege in this era. Full military honors, though, were something Montcalm wasn't able to fully convey to some of his native allies, more than a few of which spoke languages none of the Canadians could understand. When the natives wanted to get to the looting, they were very upset when the French said they couldn't plunder the fort, as the full honors allowed the captives to have their things, the natives having a more vae victis approach to their defeated enemies. As a result, many natives began attacking the prisoners' camp, forcing the French to stand guard around the British to prevent the natives from attacking them. When the prisoners were to be moved to Fort Edward under French escort, the prisoners were again attacked, scalping the wounded still in camp, holding up wagons and taking men, women, and children, some 200 of which were never recovered by the French. These captives brought with them smallpox, and some historians believe are linked to the first major outbreaks of such in the upper Mississippi. News of the massacre spread like wildfire throughout British North America. Shortly thereafter, the planned attack on Louisbourg had failed. Plagued by a stormy late summer, the expedition was scattered by a gale on September 24th, and consequently was called off, morale plummeting among the British colonials. Blame for the defeat at Fort William Henry and the subsequent massacre fell on Brigadier General Daniel Webb, commander of the New York frontier, who refused to reinforce Monroe, believing William Henry to be a lost cause and not wanting his army to leave Albany undefended. Webb was widely called a coward and soon recalled, nevertheless, the incident not preventing his promotion the next year. There was a similar chaos in New France between Governor-General Vaudreuil and General Montcalm, with Montcalm declining Vaudreuil's orders to continue on to Fort Edward, citing the condition of the roads, deepening the rift between the two, which only got worse as Vaudreuil had to work to recover the British captives. The aforementioned stormy summer and introduction of the pox into the upcountry had effects all their own. In New France, a poor harvest rolled into a hard winter, combined with a scheme by Intendant Francois Bigot and his cronies to sell supplies to the colonists at inflated prices, using the crisis to profit, deeply affecting New France's ability to feed and thus defend itself. In the spring, Western trade was far slower than usual, as smallpox was running rampant throughout the native communities, something the tribes blamed on the French bringing them bad medicine and protecting the British prisoners at William Henry. The British had no such problems, though. In fact, the British had a very productive summer. On May 29th, an army consisting of roughly 1,400 mostly British regulars, under the command of Major General Jeffrey Amherst, set sail from Halifax with 22 ships of the line and 15 frigates, landing at Louisbourg on June 8th and beginning a nearly 7-week siege, with the garrison capitulating on the morning of July 27th after heavy fighting. The French had expected to receive the honors of war, seeing how it took over a month for them to give up, but General Amherst had a different opinion. Amherst was very deeply affected by what he heard from the survivors of the Oswego massacre, believing the French didn't do enough to prevent their allies from attacking the prisoners, and was deeply biased and cruel in his treatment of the Louisbourg garrison. Though the staunch defense prevented the British in their ultimate end goal of going directly to Quebec from Louisbourg, so they at least accomplished something. The fortifications themselves were dismantled rather than run the risk of them falling back into French hands and shipped back to New England where they were used in various construction projects. While Louisbourg was under siege, 20,000, mostly provincial troops, mustered on the ruins of Fort William Henry, marching to Fort Carillon on July 5th, under the command of General James Abercrombie, the commander-in-chief of British forces in North America, and began the bloodiest battle of the war in North America. General Montcalm, with only 3,600 mixed French, Canadian, and native troops, inflicted over 2,500 casualties on the British, over 1,000 being fatal. General Abercrombie was recalled in disgrace, and his position as Commander-in-Chief North America, as well as a nice promotion to Lieutenant General, was given to the hero of Louisbourg, Jeffrey Amherst. On August 25th, Lieutenant Colonel John Bradstreet and 26,000 mostly provincial troops landed at Fort Frontenac on the northeast shore of Lake Ontario, beginning a siege of the rundown old fort that hadn't been strategically important since the construction of Fort Niagara, Fort Detroit, and Fort Michilimackinac, mostly being a harbor for trading ships on the lake and a supply depot stop on the way west, but Montcalm's use of the fort as a staging area against Oswego put it on the list. The garrison surrendered after a day of resistance, the mortar of the old fort's foundations and walls crumbling faster than either side thought. Though the loss of Frontenac wasn't strategically important, it had a major morale effect on both the British and French colonies. Bradstreet departed Albany with over 3,000 troops, losing nearly 600 to desertion, indicating the morale of the American colonials. Bradstreet was also able to plunder nearly 1,000,000 livres worth of goods, 60 cannons, and 12 French ships before razing what remained of the fort and retreating back to New York with the loot, receiving a promotion from Amherst to Deputy Quartermaster General for his trouble. In a fit of sour grapes, the Canadians declared Fort Frontenac obsolete anyway, and it wasn't rebuilt by the French. By September, 6,000 troops under General John Forbes were making an advance once more on Fort Duquesne. Nominally led by Forbes, who was actively dying of a wasting disease, the expedition was left in the hands of the Swiss mercenary Lieutenant Colonel Henry Bouquet, who was accompanied by George Washington. Much to the chagrin of Washington and the Virginians, Forbes elected to take a more northerly route from Carlisle, Pennsylvania to Fort Ligonier, modern-day Ligonier in Westmoreland County, before the final stretch to Duquesne, creating the Forbes Road slowly and deliberately over the summer. It wouldn't be the British military that defeated the French in the Ohio country, though. On October 26th, representatives from Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey met with 12 chiefs representing the Lenape, Mingo, who had flipped after Braddock's defeat, and Shawnee in the town of Easton in Northampton County, Pennsylvania, coming to an agreement in the Easton Treaty. In the treaty, the natives traded their alliance to the French and all Lenape claims in New Jersey for some land returned in Pennsylvania, a recognition of hunting rights in the Ohio country, and a promise not to settle west of the Alleghenies, as well as 1,000 Spanish dollars to the Lenape for their quitclaims in New Jersey. With the loss of the local natives following the Treaty of Easton, the French position in the Ohio was compromised. Had the situation been normal in Canada, maybe they could have rallied a defense like in 1755, but with the Pays-de-Haut closed due to pox and a struggling economy, as Forbes' army approached, the French commander François-Marie Marchand de Lignery elected to scuttle the fort and abandon the forks of the Ohio, sending some of his troops downriver to the Illinois country and retreating with the rest up the Allegheny to Fort Machault. Forbes's army reached the smoldering ruins of Duquesne on November 25th, Forbes shortly returning to Philadelphia where he would succumb to his illness, leaving Captain Hugh Mercer to hold the forks and preside over the construction of Fort Pitt. The losses in New France are accompanied by a generally disappointing French performance elsewhere around the world. The new foreign minister in France, Etienne François, Marquis de Stainville, Duc de Choiseul, decided to throw the dice high with a bold and brash invasion of England, and accordingly began siphoning resources from the other theaters, a fatal move for New France. Unsurprisingly, the Royal Navy prevented the French invasion, defeating the French fleet at the Battle of Quiberon Bay, while continuing to fund the Prussians and supply their colonies in North America. On July 26, 1759, General Amherst arrived at Fort Carillon, but before his army had time to prepare for a siege, the 400-strong French garrison, under direct orders from General Montcalm, attempted to scuttle the fort, igniting the gunpowder magazine before fleeing to Fort St. Frederick. The sturdy walls of Carillon were more or less fine despite the large explosion, and Amherst's troops quickly occupied the fort, renaming it to Fort Ticonderoga, the Mohawk word for the land on which the fort sits. Amherst pursued the fleeing French to Fort St. Frederick, which was more successfully destroyed, retreating again to Montreal. At about this time, the siege of Fort Niagara was wrapping up. Began by Brigadier General John Prideaux on June 6th, command fell to William Johnson after Prideaux's untimely decapitation by one of his own mortars. Johnson was technically no longer a major general, but superintendent of Indian Affairs with the Royal Commission to colonel for his previous service, and here only technically as a tag-along with the Mohawks attending the battle, who continued the siege, accepting the garrison's surrender following the defeat of a relief army at the Battle of La Belle Famille, 2 miles south of Niagara, by Johnson's Iroquois allies and regulars led by Colonel Eyre Massey, who deferred command to Johnson after Prideaux's death. Upon his appointment to Commander-in-Chief, General Amherst was compelled to go to the de facto war capital of Albany, leaving Major General James Wolfe in charge of the attack on Quebec City. Wolfe's fleet arrived in the St. Lawrence in April, with the young explorer James Cook methodically charting and guiding the fleet upriver, making a name for himself as a cartographer and naval officer, with the fleet initiating a 3-month-long naval bombardment. Wolfe also deployed a battery of artillery on Point Levis across the river on June 29th, which was highly effective at bombarding the lower city, before landing his main army of 4,000 British regulars at Beauport at night between July 8th and 9th. On July 31st, Wolfe led an attack on the defenses of Beauport that was repulsed by French troops when a summer shower got all the British powder wet mid-advance, falling back to reconsider his position as disease began to ravage the British camp. On September 12th, Wolfe redeployed his troops to the west side of the city, landing at a small cove called Anse au Foulon, ascending a narrow goat path up the promontory of Quebec. The British took the scant French sentries by surprise, with the commander of the Highlanders, Captain Fraser, answering one of the sentries' challenges in perfect French, allowing for a foothold on top of the promontory and arranging for battle on the Plains of Abraham on the morning of September 13th. Montcalm rushed his troops over to the new British position and arranged his mostly Canadian troops in a traditional European formation, leading 3,000 of them in a swift attack in an attempt to dislodge the British before they had a chance to dig in. Despite the apprehensions of the Canadians, Montcalm was eager for a pitched battle. The Canadians fired 2 volleys, getting closer each time. Wolfe's troops waited until after the French fired a second time to fire themselves. According to the journal of Captain John Knox, the British, who Wolfe had ordered to load an extra ball into their muskets, gave them, with great calmness, as remarkable a close and heavy discharge as I ever saw. The volley broke the Canadians, who routed, doubling their panic as the 78th Fraser's Highlanders Regiment pursued them with swords all the way back to the city gates. Wolfe had been killed at the height of the fighting, taking 3 musket balls from the French. Montcalm fared little better. Among the only French on horseback during the battle, Montcalm was either hit with a canister shot or the British focused their fire on him. Regardless, he was riddled with wounds and died the next day in Quebec City. Following Montcalm's death, Jean-Baptiste Nicolas Roche, the Seigneur de Ramesay, King Louis's lieutenant in Canada, was abandoned in Quebec as Governor-General Vaudreuil fled to Montreal. Ramesay was given standing orders to not give up the city by Vaudreuil, but the citizens of Quebec, who by this point had endured constant bombardment with both regular shot and incendiary shells, demanded Ramesay's surrender rather than see the city plundered and further destroyed. On September 18th, Ramesay, Admiral Sir Charles Saunders, and General George Townsend signed the Articles of Capitulation of Quebec, with the remaining French soldiers leaving the city with full honors, as well as the property rights of the citizens and freedom to practice Catholicism respected. The French attempted to retake Quebec in the spring, initiating a siege on April 29th, but the British relief fleet reached Quebec first, as the French Armada had been defeated squarely at Quiberon Bay, forcing the Canadians to disengage on May 15th, retreating back to Montreal. François de Lévis had assumed command after Montcalm's death. The capture of Quebec City was a military disaster, and now the Canadians were surrounded, with not only no way to get support from France, but no support expected from France. Lévis had about 3,200 French regulars and Marines. His Canadian militia were an ever-shifting mass of soldiers, impossible to count, as men were constantly showing up with others deserting. The slow trickle of native allies leaving Lévis' side became a flood as Rogers' Rangers raided the supply depot of St. Teresa to the northwest, with the number of Canadians markedly falling as Amherst drew closer. General Amherst ordered a three-pronged encirclement of Montreal, leaving Oswego on August 10th and arriving at Montreal from the west with a little over 11,000 troops on September 6th, delivering a devastating defeat at the Battle of Thousand Islands just up the river on August 24th, laying siege to Montreal. That same day from the east, Colonel James Murray arrived, having slowly worked his way upriver, capturing Trois-Rivières with little fighting and pacifying the habitants, as well as signing a treaty of peace and friendship with the Huron before joining his forces with Amherst. One day after Amherst left for Montreal, Major General William Haviland marched north from Crown Point, capturing Isle aux Noix, a fortified island in the middle of the Richelieu River, and Fort Chambly, dislodging its 70-year-old garrison commander before joining Amherst. After some negotiation, the Articles of Capitulation of Montreal were signed on September 8, 1790, at a house outside the walls called Capitulation Cottage. The Chevalier de Lévis initially refused to surrender without military honors, but in the face of Amherst's general refusal was unable to rally any substantive support among the garrison, instead electing to throw something of a hissy, destroying his sword and burning his colors so they wouldn't fall into Amherst's hands. The Canadians accepted their status as British subjects, though not happily. There was no large-scale resistance movement following capitulation, and the few holdouts in the west, like the garrison of Fort Pontchartrain du Detroit, surrendering to Rogers' Rangers by the following spring. Following the capitulation of Montreal, it was clear that the situation was different than at the end of King George's War. Owing to France's poor performance overall in the war, they had nothing with which to trade New France back for. In addition to Canada, the British would also capture Guadeloupe, St. Lucia, Martinique, Dominica, Grenada, St. Vincent, the Grenadines, and Tobago in the Caribbean, Pondicherry in India, Isle aux Gorées off Senegal, and Belle Isle off the coast of Brittany, which was returned for the only British territory lost, the Isle of Minorca in the Mediterranean. In an act of what I could only assume was desperation, King Louis traded Louisiana in the secret Treaty of Fontainebleau, signed in 1762, which gave Louisiana to his cousin Charles III of Spain as a consolation prize for Spain joining the war on France's side and getting quickly defeated by Britain at Havana and Manila. As a result, Spain fully ceded not only Florida, but all of Louisiana east of the Mississippi to get Cuba back, and France ceded Canada, Dominica, Grenada, St. Vincent, the Grenadines, and Tobago for Guadeloupe, Martinique, St. Lucia, Gorée, and their Indian possessions, retaining St. Pierre and Miquelon off Newfoundland as fishing bases. France would later get Louisiana back with the Treaty of Aranjuez in 1801, traded to Spain for Tuscany and 6 warships, only for Napoleon to sell up to the United States following the loss of Haiti's sugar plantations, which made the New World largely no longer profitable for France. Saint Pierre and Miquelon, just off of Newfoundland, are the last holdouts of New France. With a population of about 6,000, the small windswept islands are the only place in North America that is governed by France, lasting as a sort of whisper of what was. The islands were depopulated a few times in later wars, but always found their way back to France. The islands were also captured by Charles de Gaulle's Free France during the Second World War, as the islands initially fell under Vichy control. Today the territory struggles economically, as such remote fishing islands tend to do, with tourism a growing sector of the economy. And that's it. What was began by French fishermen in 1508 ends in two little fishing islands in the Gulf of the St. Lawrence, as the last echo of a colony that spanned from the broken coasts of Nova Scotia to the Great Plains as far west as Manitoba. Thank you for watching. A like and a subscribe to Mid-Atlantic Chronicles would be much appreciated. More videos to come. If you have a topic about American history you would like discussed or just have something to say, feel free to leave a comment. Thank you again.